You're listening to Gender, a Wider Lens.
I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States. Since 2016, my practice has been exclusively dedicated to gender questioning teens and families impacted by gender dysphoria.
I also work with gender questioning teenagers, and I facilitated support meetings for families and individuals who've been impacted by gender issues.
We're curious about the concept of gender and how it's unfolding in the wider culture.
Join us as we look at gender through a wider lens. We're really looking forward to our second Wider Lens Renewal retreat at the very end of October.
Yes, it's going to be right here in my backyard in beautiful Scottsdale, Arizona.
It was a really special occasion, and it really did seem to be truly transformative. And parents who attended last time were very keen to come together for another retreat.
Yeah, and for those of you who didn't attend last time, this is a retreat for parents who are seeking a deeper understanding of themselves and of their gender questioning child.
And it's also for parents who need some time out for some self-reflection and who want to parent with more confidence.
Yeah, so please join me, Stella, and our dear friend and colleague Lisa Marciano in Scottsdale, Arizona this fall. The Eventbrite link will be in the show notes, and you can also Google Wider Lens Renewal Retreat Arizona. We hope to see you there. Psychologist Dr. Maggy Goldsmith, which is a pseudonym by the way, was working as an independent contractor at the psychological and counseling services of a small progressive liberal arts college when her 16-year-old daughter announced that she identified as transmasculine and wanted to use he/him pronouns. Unable to find appropriate help for her daughter, who was intensifying her demands for cross-sex hormone treatment as she got closer to her 18th birthday, Maggie embarked with her on a very special trip to their ancestral homeland. While there, Maggie wrote about her experiences as a clinician and as a parent of a gender-questioning adolescent. In her first PITT Substack essay, titled, "To My Daughter's Therapist, You Were Wrong," Maggie wrote about her daughter's process of shedding this transgender identity as she worked to build a more resilient and flexible sense of self. That essay got over 20,000 reads within the first 3 months of its publication. Her second PITT essay, titled Trans and the Myth of Sloppy Parenting, explored the conditions that made her family fertile ground for gender ideology, and how ultimately the parent-child bond was the solvent for her daughter's gender dysphoria. Maggie's clinical work with teens and families impacted by gender dysphoria is guided by child and adolescent development theory, and a belief that a good working alliance between therapist and parent can act as a scaffolding to support the young person's mental health and emotional growth. We had such a great time talking with Maggie that we decided this is going to have to be part 1 of a 2-part series. So today she talks about her experience with her daughter's trans identity. And then in part 2, maybe a couple weeks from now, we're going to explore the psychoanalytic perspective and how Maggie frames gender identity, gender exploration within the family context, and so many other things. So this is a wonderful discussion. We hope you enjoy our conversation with Maggy Goldsmith. Stella, we have another lovely guest today.
We certainly do. Maggy Goldsmith, you're very welcome to Gender a Wider Lens.
Thanks for having me.
So we have a lot of interesting things to talk with you about today. Maybe we can start with kind of where you were working, what that was like around the time that your child started to question her gender.
Okay. So I was working at a very progressive, very sort of small liberal arts college. I was working as an independent contractor at that point. But before that, I had trained there as a postdoc. And so I have a long sort of perspective of how things changed at the center itself over time. And because I was an independent contractor, I think I was a little bit removed from what the staff were actually doing and thinking. So I had a little bit of a more objective view. So when I was there as a trainee in the aughts, there was, this was before the sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, the gender
Explosion.
And there were no sort of, I mean, you had You had butch lesbians, you had gay people, you had students coming in for all kinds of relational issues. But in the 5 years that I was there as a trainee, I can't tell you that I had a single person who was saying they were transgender. So I was there 5 years as a trainee because at the same time I had small children and I was raising them. And then I took a hiatus. And then I went back as an independent contractor. And when I went back, I would say it must have been around 2015, I started noticing pronouns in people's bios, in people's signatures, like emails that I would get from the school. And I would be like, what is they, them? Like, what is this? And then every so often, a student would like show up on my schedule and it would say the student's name and it would say the student's preferred pronouns. And every so often, I would get someone with they, them pronouns. And I would go home and I would like literally make a joke of it. And I would be like, I got a they, them on my schedule today. And my kid, like I never imagined in a million years that like this was a thing that was serious or, I thought people play around with their identity, people, whatever. So, and I was blissfully ignorant, I have to say, at that point in time about any of it. And so comes around 2019, 2020, the pandemic starts. And this is when my daughter comes to me. And one night we're driving home from a friend's house and she says, I think that, after college, maybe sometime in my 20s, I might want to try some hormone therapy. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. What do you mean? And she says, well, it would make it easier for me to like build muscle, like my voice might be a little deeper. It might be, might speed up my metabolism a little bit. And I'm
So
like,
can I ask you, because I'm really geeked
yeah.
out into bodybuilding right now, was she like a bodybuilder? Because that's
No.
actually not a weird question for people who are like
Okay,
bodybuilding,
so
though it's not healthy.
we
But
will get to
did that
that.
just come
We're
out of
going to
the
get
blue?
to that. Yeah.
Okay,
No.
okay.
You're incredibly sort of prescient in asking that.
Okay.
So, and I was, again, blissfully ignorant. And I was like, that sounds really interesting. Maybe I'll try that. I would love to have a faster metabolism.
Could I and a higher libido? Could I ask? Was she at odds with? Was she uneasy? Was she sad in herself at that point, or?
So yes, I think. I like to think in terms of like what triggers are there triggers for this, and I do think that there was a trigger. So my kid, gifted in art, gifted verbally, was drawing before she could talk, was talking very early, very smart, very alert, but very atypical in many ways. So didn't really fit in with the suburban, very white sort of profile of her peers at this very competitive high school, public high school she was at, which is ranked usually in the top 20 or 50 schools in this big United States.
But since you created that contrast, would you mind sharing like what is her ethnic background, just so the listener can understand?
So I would just to sort of protect her identity.
Sure.
I would say that our ethnic background can be identified as Southwest Asian.
Okay, so keep going.
The Middle East, the Near East, that part of the world.
Okay, fair enough. So she's atypical. She's very smart, but she's atypical, doesn't quite fit in with the other suburban girls.
Right. So no Barbie doll hair, no Barbie doll legs. But, like different, but cute, right? So she always thought of herself as one of the elite smart kids at this school. And at this school, when you go from freshman year to sophomore year, you can try out for this thing that's, it's like Model UN. And all the elite smart kids get into Model UN. And because she was part of this, like, that's how she identified herself.
Mm-hmm.
And when she did a presentation, she was a little bit controversial in how she presented her ideas, in terms of the Middle East. and so she wasn't accepted into Model UN. And I think that was a huge narcissistic blow for her.
What age was she around?
So now she was 14 when she started high school. Now we're talking about going into her 15th year.
That's really hard.
So she's 15. She's not part of the sort of like the popular sporty kids. She's not part of the popular geeky STEM kids. And now she's been told she can't be part of the elite intellectual kids. And so now
she's at C now. An identity crisis is brewing.
She's at C.
Mm-hmm.
And so, also she and I have a very typically close, almost enmeshed relationship. You guys have talked about this, how there's a very strong, powerful connection between mother and daughter. And so I'm saying to her, forget about it. We'll go do this. We'll go do that. We'll, don't worry about it. It'll be okay. So then what happened is COVID happened, right? That was in junior year. Halfway through junior year, COVID happens. Her therapist gets cancer. One of her grandfather dies. The dog dies. Dad gets COVID before there was vaccines.
Oh, God.
And this kid is like confined with me and her brother doing school online at a very critical time in her development. And so here we are. She's also very artistic. She's interested in anime and manga, all the typical stuff. But she has other interests too. She has interests in learning foreign languages. She has interests in like all kinds of things, but it all kind of collapses into this gender thing.
From the conversation of, I think I'd like to do hormone therapy in my 20s.
Yeah.
From that conversation, did it kind of hurtle?
So at that point, I was like, whatever, I'm still in the mindset at that point of like, if someone isn't really this, then it's not something that's going to stick, right? It's not something that's going to really play out. And I'm sort of thinking, okay, whatever, let it be, let it sit.
Knock yourself out, yeah.
Later on, I came to understand that as kind of a trial balloon, being floated. And, depending on how I responded to that, because remember, this is a very smart kid and a kid who knows me very well. Depending on how that trial balloon gets floated and sort of gets, perceived, then she can start escalating. So that's happening. Then, at that point, I had eyeballs on her social media. Then I read a social media post wherein she says, "My mom on my 18th birthday, happy birthday, honey, you're an adult now." Me on my 18th birthday at Planned Parenthood getting testosterone shots. And I read that and my heart sank. And I pretty much I called her over and I said, I just saw this. Like, what is this? What's going on?
Did she know? Because sometimes I talk with parents about, like, sometimes your kids are dropping messages they know you're going to see, and sometimes they have no idea that you're going to see it.
I think later on, that's what happened. Is she kind of wanted me? She wanted to escalate. She wanted me, like, I was being too sort of whatever, goosey about it. You know, by the time you're 25, you'll be completely done with this anyway. You know, why do I have to worry about it if you're saying you're going to do it at 25, right? I mean, by 25, your brain is fully cooked and we'll be fine.
And you've gone off to school, you've had life experiences.
Right.
It almost makes me think, but it's not the same, but it almost makes me think of Helena with her big kind of event. She was telling her mother about being trans, and the mother was like, and so she felt she had to make it a bigger event, if you follow me. And I could so imagine that.
You have to realize that, you know, remember that all along I've been coming home from work saying, I got another they, them on my schedule. Like, I don't understand. This is like, how can people use grammar so poorly?
Yeah.
You know, I'm thinking,
this is a grammar crisis.
What?
Yeah. This is a grammar crisis. The American needs to get degree.
You know, the nuns in Catholic school are all rolling in their graves. You know, it's like, and I was the best sentence diagrammer in my entire class. So I was a real stickler for proper grammar. And I'm coming home going, oh boy, another they, them on my schedule. And when I write my notes, I have to make sure they're in they, them format, or, you know, or else, you know, people get prickly about it if they see it.
You just pretend that you're facilitating group therapy, and it makes it very easy.
Yeah.
They corresponded to my prompt about so-and-so.
Yeah.
Just pretend it's a group. I'm just kidding. That's a bad joke. Let's continue on. So, well, I just want to think, I just think it's interesting. Your daughter knows you very well.
Yeah.
And all the while you're coming home talking about they, them, and she's just kind of documenting that in her mind.
Yeah.
Not maybe consciously, but subconsciously. She's like, what's the one thing mom's not down with?
Uh-huh.
Oh, I'll do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And this mom was down with a lot of things, you know, like when she decided that she wants to color her hair purple, I was like, let me take you to the best hairdresser in town and have that happen. You know, and she decided to give herself stick and poke tattoos. I was like, yeah, she's an artist. She did a good job. You know, like, I didn't see any of these things as like, you know, warning signs, as red flags, because I'm sitting there going, if this is who she truly is not, you know, then there's no way that this is going to be something that is, you know, that's going to stick.
Like a real risk. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm thinking, you know, we'll just keep doing what we're doing, and we'll just, you know, go on. But when I read that post about, you know, going to Planned Parenthood and getting testosterone, I was like, no, this is something different now. Now we're wading into new territory. And when I called her over and I said, so what's going on? That's when we had the big meltdown. That's when we had, you know, just telling me about how she's always felt uncomfortable in her body, how it's exhausting to have to speak with a low voice if her voice isn't low. It's exhausting to, like, you know, she said it's almost like being forced to write with your left hand if you're right-handed. You know, like, so, and I'm sitting there going, like, what is this? Like, what do I do? And at that point, I'm thinking, you know, most psychologists are thinkers, like, you know, like are well-trained, have their clinical skills, and know how to hear this as a rupture, know how to hear this as a defense, as something that the kid is doing to try to not fall apart in other ways. And so I'm thinking it'll be okay because, you know, I'll find a therapist eventually who's going to be able to sort of talk with her and, you know, really sort of process what it is that's been happening. And so, you know, here I am. I'm calling colleagues. I'm reaching out to some pretty, important names in the world of gender and sexuality. A good friend of mine who is a real expert, who was instrumental in the gender dysphoria diagnosis in the DSM-5, reached out to him, and his advice was basically, well, some kids are just like that, and maybe you need to become a more authoritarian parent.
When he said some kids are just like that, what do you think he meant?
I think he meant that there is such a thing as true trans.
But he also suggested you become more authoritarian about it. Like he believed your daughter was, quote, true trans, and that you should be more strict.
Well, so I think the proposition is, if your child is not one of these true trans kids, then the reason she's doing this is because you have not been how can I say, a strict enough parent. You have been too permissive. You have been too, liberal. You have been too encouraging. So you have been too, so it's really your fault. I mean, it's almost like, I remember I said to him, geez, you almost sound libertarian to me. That, if it's my job, it's up to me, it's my problem, it's my doing.
And it's almost like, well, if she wants it bad enough, then you'll know it's real, which is interesting because this is an argument that is made. It's along similar lines as insistent, consistent, persistent, right, Stella? We've talked a lot about this. So it's like you can supposedly ferret out the, quote, true trans people based on how desperate they are to buck your rules and go beyond, the regular means to get it. But if your kid was just caught up in a trend, she'll drop it really soon, which is a very huge misunderstanding of parent-child dynamics, of personality. Like there's so much there that doesn't make sense.
One thing I don't like about it, and I agree with you, Sasha, is that it's either you're a bad parent or she's true trans. There's your option.
Yeah.
It's either or.
Lose.
Yeah, it's either or. And I'm sitting there going, like, how is this possible? And then he slipped a few other things and said, well, the idea of reparative therapy was mostly sort of conceived in thinking about gay people, but it's been sort of adapted now by the trans identity. Like, so, there's been a conflation of trans with LGB. And I think that was an important thing I think that was a very generous thing for him to give me, and also it was kind of generous of him to say to me, you should become a more authoritarian parent, because to me, what that said is I'm on my own, and people are not going to really help you. It's like you have to be really careful. And so he also tried to put me into contact with some pretty important people in the psychoanalytic psychotherapy world who I reached out to. And, I reached out to them and I said, I'm so-and-so. I have a child who is doing this. I am not willing to consider hormones or social or medical transition without some exploratory therapy. Well, no one got back to me. And the people who did get back to me put me on 6-month waiting lists. Well, I didn't have 6 months at that point. I had, my kid was about to turn 18. And I was sort of like, No, over my dead body, this is happening without some sort of thought. So I guess what was really important to me at that point was to reach out to my colleagues and to my friends. I think part of what happens for parents who have a sort of gender questioning, trans identifying kids is that you can become really isolated. And especially if you're someone like me who's also a clinician, there can be a bit of shame about how did this go so badly off the tracks? Like, where did I mess up? Like, I mean, a true example of, I guess, the shoemaker's children go barefoot. Because, had I really been sort of watching, and had I been careful, maybe my kid would not have fallen into this. But then what I've come to realize is I have a feeling that there are many more people who are mental health practitioners who have children who are in the throes of trans identification.
Very notably, there's lots of parents who are working in mental health. Very noticeable. From the start of the GDSN, it was a really noticeable trend.
Yeah, and I'm noticing that too. And I feel like, we can't really be vocal about it. Because we're protecting our children's identity, we're protecting our children from public view, and also in a way we're protecting ourselves and our patients. Because I don't think psychologists and psychotherapists should be really out there in a political arena. So, and that's just my belief. I don't want to dictate how anybody else thinks about this, but
and furthermore, I mean, I get contacted by a lot of therapists with kids going through this who work, let's say, in a group practice or in a hospital or in some kind of setting, and they're having to, on one hand, kind of toe the affirmative model in the context of their work, which once their kid starts to question, they begin to wonder about the affirmative model that they perhaps have been using in practice for some time. And they can't really out themselves as doubting any of this because it's become just the standard operating procedures for therapists and clinicians. So it's a bind in so many ways. You're so right about how difficult that is for clinicians who are going through this at home. It's like you really have a secret life.
Yeah. And so when I say I reached out to friends and colleagues, that was really important to me, especially reaching out to colleagues. I have one colleague who I opened up to about this, a colleague who was also a trainee with me at the college and then worked at the college. So, she knows me well. She knows my work. She knows my thinking. And I remember, we went on a walk together and I opened up to her about all of this. And it was so important for someone to hear me as a clinician and tell me she doesn't think I'm crazy. And to sort of value me as a clinician, sort of saying this, how can this be? This doesn't make any sense. And even though she, in her personal life, wasn't dealing with a trans child, or I think the fact that she was able to really sort of hear what I was saying and value what I was saying was really important to me. The other thing was reaching out to my friends. When I decided to, maybe we need to travel, maybe we need to leave, that was another thing that was really important because, I have one friend who immediately said to me, never questioned why I was saying it. She said, go stay with my mother for a year, for 2 years, 3 years, however long you need to do it, just go and do it. And in my mind, that was like, wow, I have support.
Yeah. And that's so important because I think traveling is something I really, really wanted to talk with you today about, Maggie. Mm-hmm. Before we get there, I just want to ask you a bit of a kind of devil's advocate question.
Mm-hmm.
As clinicians, we are trained to be aware of our biases from Psychology 101. We all have biases and we have to be mindful of them. I'm just going to ask a question because I've heard a lot of parents are told this when they show skepticism about their child. How did you know that your assessment of what was going on with your daughter was coming from a good, loving place and not like a, quote, transphobic place?
So that's when my clinician brain sort of turns on. And that's where I'm looking at it from like a developmental perspective and from a clinical perspective. And I'm saying this doesn't make any sense. If we go with this, if I affirm this child where they are right now, what I'm doing is I am helping them crystallize in this very inflexible place, in this very brittle, binary kind of place. So I am not helping this child by helping them to crystallize this identity. My job is to help them become more flexible, help them, this is, if this gendered self is one self state, does it have to take precedence over all the other self states of this child? Why is this happening now? How is this happening? What happened in this child's development? What is it about the family and the community that this child is in that is bringing this about? So, I want to know all of that. And if we're not asking those questions, we're absolutely foreclosing on the work that we're doing. And I think that as therapists, we can label ourselves gender affirming or gender exploratory or gender critical. But if you're trained well, and if you're trained properly, and if you know your craft, then you know how to do therapy with these kids. You should. And why when my daughter went to speak with the gender therapist that she landed with, why when she and I talked, why was she insisting that, we have to affirm and we have to, this is her lived experience and all of that. And I'm saying, like, what are we talking about? Like, what are you talking about? Suicide. How do you treat a suicidal person? Like, what do? You just foreclose on whatever the demand is? Like, how does this make any sense? And so, yeah, I wonder if
I agree. I think, people don't quite understand that the likes of me and you and Sasha, we're the conventional therapists who are just talking about conventional therapy that explores the psyche, is interested in conscious motivation, is building self-awareness, and it's anti-therapeutic to be narrowly focusing on just an affirmative model. I don't think we highlight this fact enough.
We hope you're enjoying this episode of our podcast. We work very hard to maintain high-quality content for this show, and we're grateful to RIME and GenSpect for supporting us.
RIME, or Rethink Identity Medicine Ethics, is a non-profit organisation dedicated to improving long-term care for gender-variant individuals. Visit rethinkime.org to learn more.
And GenSpect is an international alliance of parents and professional groups whose aim is to advocate for parents of gender-questioning children and young people.
If you'd like to become a patron, you'll have access to weekly transcripts and special Q&As, and you can join our listener community.
Now back to the show. But, I keep thinking about like the parents who I really believe earnestly are trying to sort this out. And sometimes they'll say, but Sasha, what if she is? What if she is trans and I am saying no and I am dismissing it and I am pushing against it? Is that going to cause some kind of psychic wound? So I think like what I'm circling here is all three of us go into these conversations with a fundamental assumption that That's not a real thing to say this person is born trans, and if they have discovered it and I'm pushing against it. I think we're saying there are a lot of ways to understand what's going on with oneself when a defense mechanism like this comes up, or when a fixation on changing your body comes up. There are many ways to walk around it. So I'm just really sympathetic to those parents who have that question in their mind. And so it's a constant battle of like, what if I'm destroying my kid's soul by pushing against it? So that's what I'm touching on.
And that goes back to the conflating gay with trans is the same experience. And it's just...
Well, but also there's something that happens to adolescents, I think, at this point in their lives, where they enter something, I mean, I don't want to be too technical, but there's something about their mind's work where they really attach to binaries. They really attach to black-white thinking. And part of that is also that they have an inability to be historical. And they're very, very present day focused. And so they kind of compel the parent to be present day focused. And so that's something that I try to get at. You know, the child will say, and even if they're thinking about the past, they're sort of conflating the past with how they feel now. So a kid will say, you know, I always hated wearing dresses. But then, you know, you'll bring out pictures of the kid, you know, very happily smiling, wearing dresses. You know, and so how do you make sense of this? So there's very much a denial of history, but also there's sort of like a fixation in the present, a freezing, a crystallization where the kid can't really see themselves 5 years from now, can't see themselves 10 years from now. And, you know, it's sort of like, you know, my daughter wanted to become, you know, a trans boy, but had no idea what that would look like when she's her father's age. And, you know,
she wanted to be a cute...
losing her hair like him.
Yeah. She wanted to be a cute 18-year-old trans boy. No interest in...
I would love to be a cute 18-year-old anything, but like, you know...
Could you go back?
How does that happen?
You left us on a cliffhanger. She was coming up to her 18th birthday, and you were going, we need some proper... What you said is we basically need thought. That's all you were requesting from the situation, and you weren't getting it. So what happened then?
I wasn't getting it. So, but, you know, also you have to, like, look at the context of what was happening. And I had hints that maybe there was going to be some questioning. And one thing that happened is, okay, so she buzzed her hair off. And that was like, all right, she buzzed her hair off. She started wearing these hoodies. You know, it's like she fully embraced the look. And then one day she took a big box and she put all of her girl clothes in it. And she took this box and put it right in the middle of my bedroom. And I left it there. Because I saw that, I heard that as, here is my girlhood, hold it for me. And I just left it there. And I left it there for months. I didn't touch it. You know, to the point where my husband was like, how long is this going to stay? How long am I going to have to walk around this? And I was like, as long as you need to, you know? And he was like, all right. So that was one sign that, you know, I said, maybe something. Another sign to me was, so at one point in June is a terrible month for people, for parents who have trans identifying kids, by the way, because of Pride, and because Pride has been sort of, you know, co-opted by trans.
And because there's also heightened leaving school and coming out before you leave school. Proms.
Yeah, the transition periods, that's so true.
Biggie, it's a huge one. Yeah.
And this was again, you know, there was no prom because of COVID. And there was a lot of kids didn't So a lot of these like normative things weren't happening
these
in
like
kids' lives.
climactic moments that are so important. Kids were like, well, I guess I'll figure out my own way to create one.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I remember that like at one point in June, she saw a post by when she was in middle school, there was this child who was medically transitioning. And my daughter had become a very powerful ally to this child. And I loved this about her. I was very supportive. I was very sort of proud of her for, being this kid's ally. So comes June of senior year, this child eventually moved to a different school district or whatever. And this child is now a guy, has fully transitioned. And she sees a post of him, with his friends at graduation, just looking like a regular handsome guy going off to, some Ivy League college. And she sees that and she says, you know what? I am done. I want an appointment at the gender clinic. You need to make this appointment for me. And I was like, okay, sure, whatever. So I make an appointment. In my mind, of course, I'm going over my dead body. But I make the appointment and I send her the screenshot. And right after I sent her a screenshot, she goes online and buys dresses and high-heeled shoes.
Yes.
Right?
I know this.
Way more common than people might think, because parents are like, what is going on? What is going on? This is mind melting.
Right.
Which it is.
And so, yes. And so, but in my mind, I'm like, okay. That's what we're doing, huh? And so now, every few days she goes into the big box of clothes, she digs around in it, she takes some stuff out, puts some stuff back. She's playing around. At that point, I'm already thinking.
What were you thinking? Sorry, what were you thinking at this point?
So at that point, I'm thinking, you know what? There's a little flexibility here.
Okay.
And I think that's what you look for, right? You look for like that little bit of flexibility.
But I presume you were frightened because 18 was coming, and
I was very frightened, and I was making the appointment at the local gender clinic, but I was doing it. I wasn't, and I think she knew that I wasn't being sincere in doing it, but I did it anyway. She felt heard.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Even though it went against but again, in my mind, I already had the idea that we were going to travel.
Okay.
And this is where I want to bring up the issue of a nuclear option. And to me, the idea of getting out of here and going someplace else was kind of the nuclear option. And I was playing with all kinds of permutations of how that could happen. And I was even having fantasies of like going somewhere for a vacation and then like not coming back, and going somewhere where, nobody cares if you turned 18, like in much of the Middle East, the Near East, you're not an adult until your mom and dad tell you you're an adult. You know this, Sasha.
Yeah.
And so at this point, I have to say, I'm also remembering a story that my father told a long time ago when I was a young kid. When you're from a Middle Eastern, Near Eastern family, you have these big Sunday dinners. And very often, other families will come over. And there's often like telling of tales. And in the telling of tales, there's very often like something didactic going on. Something is being imparted. So I remember, I don't know if it was even my father or some other father who was sitting at the table and all the kids were there. And I remember this dad my dad maybe, telling a story of a family that came to the United States from, I don't know, Egypt. And the children went to school in the United States. The parents were working. They were, they were trying to build a life. And the oldest son one day starts calling the father by his first name. And the father says nothing. Because somebody told the father, if you are strict with your child, they can tell the school, and then the school can tell the authorities. And the father was like, I'm just going to keep quiet. So the father makes this plan that they're going to go back to Egypt. And so the family thinks they're going on a vacation. They get on the plane, they land, and as soon as they land, the father looks at the son and says, now call me George.
I
Now
dare
call
you
me.
to call me George.
Now call
Here.
me George. Let's see what happens. And that story stuck with me. Interesting, it's about names, right?
Yeah, that is interesting.
And to me, it's like, now make me call you he, him.
So
that's, I think that was where my notion of the nuclear option came. It's like, it's possible. I have, I can do this. And so I think what it did more than anything else is it enabled me to be bold. That I did have this thing that I could do in my back pocket. And even if I never did it, I could do things like make an appointment at the gender clinic, knowing that it's never going to be happening. I could do things like, I don't know. So I think in that sense, it emboldened me. That, at the end of the day, if nothing else works, we can go. We can leave. And so, okay, so now I'm setting up the context of our decision to go. We are, now it's June. We've had the thing with the big box of clothes. We've had the thing where she's been putting on dresses. Her hair's been growing. And so, I'm getting little glimmers that maybe she's a little more flexible than she seems to be. So then I say to her, why don't we travel? You're taking a gap year. Why don't we travel? And initially, months ago, when I had said, why don't we travel? She said, well, it's going to be really hard to be trans wherever you take me. In my mind, I'm going, that's the whole idea. But so, let's travel. So finally, again, at that point, it was June. I said, how about we travel? And she said, you know what? I've always wanted to go back to our ancestral homeland. We had gone twice before, but never for a long time.
So the flexibility that you suspected was coming into play was there. She was interested herself.
Right. And I think she was looking for an exit ramp.
Or she was also looking for her identity.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Which brings me to think about, if the trans identity is a defense, right? I mean, how do we think about defenses? You don't remove a defense until you've replaced it.
Yeah.
With something else. So is there something else that can replace this defense? Is there another identity that may be meaningful, that may be less sort of damaging or freezing, developmentally stunting?
And also that's more actually congruent with who this kid is.
Exactly. And so I said, you know what? Yeah, let's do it. And knowing that she likes to study foreign languages, I found a school where she could study some really interesting foreign languages that she never, she was interested in, but hadn't really had an opportunity to study. And I was like, look, I found this and we can do this. And she's like, oh my God, let's do it.
Could I ask one thing? You've been very generous saying that you had the option and that, that made it a little bit easier. I think you're saying that almost towards the parents who don't have it. But to your credit, you did do it. And to your credit, you found this course.
Yeah.
Was it an upheaval in your family? Was it
Oh,
a hard
yes.
decision?
It was, because I also at that she has a younger brother who was 16 at the time, she was 18, he was 16, and the sort of like, they were very close growing up, and then puberty hit and she became interested in other things and they sort of diverged, but her brother always looked up to her, and the sort of the willingness he had to support her in her trans identity was something that he felt was so important that he right away became the cheerleader. And he
Wow.
became the one to say, Mom, you better start using the right pronouns. You're such a TERP, you're such a transphobe. So I felt like there was, I felt like it was a really toxic situation for him too. Like, he shouldn't have had to do that. He shouldn't have had to sort of become deluded in order to reconnect with his sister. And the interesting thing is, even though he was the one going with the pronouns, going with, everything, she was even bitchier to him. It wasn't like it opened her up to a level of more kindness towards him.
And you brought her, am I right, and went to this course. And am I right in thinking he stayed behind? So this was
He stayed behind with
event in your family.
Very, 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 very upheavalish. I don't think I could have done it if not for internet. If not for the fact that I could sort of Zoom with my son, and I could, like, follow his school bus every morning as he was getting on the school bus to go to school, and like, text him saying welcome home when he came home from school every day. I think it was also very growthful for him, and he and his father really connected during the time that we were gone. So it was sort of important. I think it was challenging, and it was very difficult for me. At one point, someone who was important to me said to me, you're abandoning your son.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Ouch.
And I was like, oh, that is so painful.
Yeah.
You don't get it. This person was also a psychologist. And so that to me was, it was crushing.
Yeah.
But, on the other hand, I did open up to my parents, and they said, go do this. We're 100% behind you. We will help with your son. We'll make sure everything is fine. I had friends who said, yeah, go, we'll be here for them. And my husband, who said, do it. If this feels right to you, then go do this.
And I want to talk about what that time was like in this other country. There's so much to still cover, and we don't have a ton of time. So can you tell us, what was it like when you and your daughter kind of got to the new country and you began your time there? What happened?
So it wasn't ideal in many ways because COVID was there too. So a lot of things that, could have been much more interesting and fun and like social for her were not. But there were a few really important things that happened there. First of all, our native language doesn't have gendered pronouns.
Wow, that's huge.
I think it's huge, yes. So one of the things that happened while we were still home was that whenever we were home and I had to refer to her in the third person to another person, like to her dad, I would switch languages.
Wow.
So that I didn't have to, transgress.
That's right. That's
in
right.
any way. Yeah. And so that was
takes
the
the
first
pressure
thing.
off. It just gives you a little distance, separation from the gender focus.
So that. Second, this is a country where I mean, for good or for bad, gender roles are pretty stable. But also, it's a kind of place where, I mean, I'm going to sound like I'm idealizing it a little bit, and I'm not, because it has lots of problems. But it's a place where men and women have very sort of clear ways of interacting with each other. So, like, for example, my daughter, I don't think had ever had a boy hold a door for her. And that happened. You know, same age peers refer to each other as sister and brother.
Mm-hmm.
If a girl is being accosted or anything on the street, men will come out and defend, like there's no messing around. Like, everyone is very, very respectful of their roles. And some of that is great and some of that is stifling, but it's exactly what she needed at that place, at that point in time. Also, I think, like, being immersed in a new language, in her native language, and also connecting to history. Remember how earlier I said these kids really lose a sense of historicity?
Yes.
And being in her native land, I think, just inevitably put her in a place where she had to consider her history. And the other thing is that she saw people who looked like her more.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I remember one of the first days she came home from school, she said, "Mom, this very nice young boy pulled me over and said to me, 'You're very beautiful.'" And that was that. And that just walked away. So there was that piece of it. What else about it? So learning the language, also, she was independent there because it's also very safe. And it's a city, so she got around on her own. She walked around. She went on a hike. She went on a few hikes in the mountains with other students at the university. And it was just a really, really interesting and special time. She didn't have to spell her last name for anybody. That was another thing.
Yeah, totally.
So she really felt a sense of belonging. And it's funny, like, one day she pretty much immediately started dressing differently and started, like, wearing makeup. Not that any of that is important, but that she had the flexibility to do that. To sort of, like, see herself in a skirt and say, like, this isn't so bad. I actually look good.
It kind of reminds me, funnily enough, it brought it back when you said about the boy saying you're very beautiful. When I had my own issues, and then, I went through my early teens, and I thought I was the ugliest kid in the world. And then when I was 16, my best friend did this thing with me, and she was obviously trying to help me out, looking back on it. And she was a budding hairdresser, and she cut my hair and she dyed it. And I had I can't emphasize, I did not do looks. And I walked in, I'd just left the hairdresser, and I walked along, and I knew something extraordinary had happened. I knew I just looked so different. It's hard to explain, but it was absolutely transformative. And my mom said to me to go around and get chips for the family. So I walked around and I walked into the chipper. I don't think you have that, anyway, the cafe. And I opened the door, and this bloke who was at the counter, he just looked over and he went, "Gorgeous." And I was like, "Me? Me?" And it was just so shocking and heart-stopping. It was like, "Me?" And I knew it kind of was. And it was like, and and I know that's like what we're not meant to be impressed with. And I know, but there was something about that moment for me that was like.
But also, Stella, I feel like if you hadn't been ready for that moment, it wouldn't have mattered.
Yeah.
And your friend, if you hadn't been ready for that moment, your friend would not have been able to style your hair.
True.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have. So there was a
Yeah,
developmental piece that
yeah.
happened
Because I was 16, it was
before
years
that.
later. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Anyway, go
yeah.
back. Sorry, yours is much more interesting. Keep going.
So yeah. I don't know. Like, I have so much more that I could say about, like, the mother-daughter relationship during this time. The sort of, it wasn't easy. It wasn't, because of COVID, as I said, it was kind of isolating, for me anyway. And I was away from my son and my husband and my family, and so it wasn't easy, but it was sort of like what I had to do. And I
Yeah.
had to sort of, like, and it wasn't ideal in that. So, for example, some people said to me, she needs to separate. She needs to go to university. She needs to. And I'm sitting there going, no, I know she needs to separate. But if she goes to university, the first thing she's going to do is go to the health center there and, get hormones. I can't do that, like, but you're going to take her there and she's going to end up living with you, and, it's going to end up being the same. And I said, no, it's going to be different.
Yeah. She had her own life too. She wasn't just under mama's wing the whole time. She
Right.
was meeting other people. She was out and about. She was hanging out with people. She was doing her language studies.
Right.
And
Exactly.
I know your story. So would you be comfortable sharing, like, her perspective changed on gender partially because of being immersed in a new culture? Could
Yeah.
you share how she started to think about American culture and its relationship with gender?
So I think that, where we are now it's exactly almost a year since the day we departed.
And you're back in the US?
We're back in the US. We were there for 4 months, exactly. And so I think, so here's the interesting thing. I always, when I work with families and with kids, I always say, this thing is kind of a marathon. And what it is like, in the beginning, you get this, like, big explosion and the big announcement and the big everything, but you're not going to get that on the other end. It's going to just die away, and you're going to have escalations along the way. And how you deal with those escalations is going to sort of, like, make or break what happens.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of families, a lot of parents are just so ready to have the kid come and say, Mom, that was kind of dumb. I think I'm done. But, like, that's not going to happen. And if it does happen, it's not going to happen until long after. So even now, I don't know that we can actually talk about it. We can talk around it. We can talk, like, philosophically about things. But we can't really talk about it. But I remember, there's so much that I sort of could say about how I knew we were done. We were on the way back, and we were in an airplane. We were in Dubai, getting ready to fly back to the States. And I remember we were on the line. We were on the sort of getting ready to board the airplane for the long, I guess, 15, 19-hour flight. And I said to her, I don't know where you are with all this gender stuff, but I want you to know that I'm done. I want you to know that I am not doing pronouns. And I want you to know that I expect you to tell your father and your brother that this is your name, and that you are now she, her pronouns. This is what I expect. I said, I'm exhausted with this, and I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. And she had a good cry, a good long cry. And she said, Mom, I've been done for a long time.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
She's like, I've been done with this for a really long time. And I said, but why wouldn't you tell me? Why wouldn't you say, you knew how hard this was? And she said, because I didn't want you to think that you made me do it. And I didn't want you to think that you saved my life.
Oh, this is it. Yeah.
And then later on, when we talked about it some more, you know, I remember her saying, I said, what was this all about? Like, what was this? And she said, I didn't want to be yours anymore. I didn't want to be yours anymore. She needed to separate. And she didn't have the tools to do it with. And so, I mean, there's a lot to be said about that, right? About the idea of separation, about the idea of continuity and discontinuity, continuity with the mother, discontinuity with the mother, separateness, togetherness. You know, now a year later, you know, she invites me to do things with her. For the first time in 18 years, we went and got pedicures together. I mean, everybody else looks at that and goes, oh, big deal, you got a pedicure. And I'm like, oh, no, you don't understand. We went and got pedicures together.
Yeah.
So that's the story. I think I talked mostly as a mom and not so much as a clinician. But
I don't know about you guys, but I feel like there's a part 2 brewing here where we just talk about the psychoanalytic position on these things, because you do have some really interesting, very poignant theories about this. And I know when we interviewed Lisa Duvall, for example, it was really insightful to hear about her experience with her kid, but then she also talked as a clinician. So I'd love to hear you talk as a clinician.
Yeah.
I would love to do that. Because I really think that, you know, what I do is as a clinician is, you know, you guys know, is pretty much what like parents can be doing at home. It's really not that, you know, I mean, it has its, you know, special things about it, but really, I mean, much of what we do can be translated into the parent-child relationship. And I do think that, you know, it's, and I think that other clinicians would benefit from knowing more about, you know, at this point, for a long time, I didn't want to work with kids because I didn't feel like I had enough distance from it.
Yeah.
But now I am working with kids who are gender questioning, trans-identified, and their families. And you know, it's very interesting work. I think it's very demanding and challenging work, demanding and challenging. But at the same time, I think that, you know, if we just stick to our chops as clinicians, if we really just stick to what we know and what we do, you know, and I think that's how we help these kids.
That's right. Yeah. Well, Maggie, thank you for, I guess, part 1. We look forward to part 2 somewhere down the line.
Yeah, this was great, guys.
It's a
really
good
wonderful
story.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a lovely, lovely ending, reconnecting with a little bit of distance, which maybe you both needed.
I think so, yeah.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens. This podcast is sponsored by Rhyme and GenSpect, and listener support means a lot to us. The best way to help is to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Follow us on social media, and if you'd like to become a patron, you'll have access to weekly transcripts of the show, special Q&As, and you can join our listener community. Just go to our Linktree. That's linktr.ee/widerlenspod.
Our discussions are for educational purposes only and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.